Welcome to lecture number one of the post-war era, the Cold War. This is Social Studies 10, and I'm Mr. Banks. So we'll start by looking at the period right after World War II into the 1950s and 60s. We will look at things like the atomic age, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. We'll look at the paranoia of the Cold War era, the consumer culture, the baby boom, and all the different leaders in Canada and the United States. So let's go to our unit questions. Okay, so the questions, the main questions for this unit, the things that we will be writing about or close to what we'll be writing about at the end, the unit questions. What was the Cold War? So we'll look at what exactly was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union in the post-war period, and where did Canada fit in? Canada was a middle power. We'll look at the origins of the Cold War and the consequences of the Cold War. Second one, what was life like during the nuclear age? A whole generation of people, and we forget this, grew up thinking that they were probably at some point in their lives going to get obliterated by a nuclear weapon. So that had an effect on the psyche and politics and everything during this time period, and didn't really stop until the fall of communism in the late 1980s, early 1990s. How did Canadians and Americans react to the threat of communism in this period? So we'll look at the different communist witch hunts, especially in America, and we'll look at how Canadian and American politics were affected by this fear of communism. How did Canada protect and define its identity during the period? So Canada, out of World War II, is becoming less British and more American, more influenced by America. So as Canadians, sometimes we have a hard time uh, figuring out what our identity is. And so this period shows governments took measures to try to protect us from a dominant American influence. And most Canadians had kind of moved away from feeling like they were part of Great Britain, which, at the time of World War One, most Canadians outside of Quebec felt part of the British Empire. So we'll see how Canadian identity changes over this period. And then finally, what political and social changes occurred during this period? Some very big changes by the 1960s. We'll see that the society is drastically changing, and once the baby boom generation becomes teenagers and young adults, they start pushing forward something called, we're going to call the counterculture. So we'll look at all the implications of that. The 1950s in Canada. So after World War II, all the soldiers are coming home and starting families. Many of them bring brides home from Europe. I'm going to show you a little video about British war brides. It's a newsreel footage from the end of the Second World War, and you'll see that a lot of Canadian soldiers met British ladies and they brought them back home to Canada. So this baby boom generation begins in the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. My mother is part of this generation. She was the product of two participants in World War II. Her father was in the New Zealand Air Force, and her mother was in the Canadian Air Force, women's division. So I told you their story in the last lecture, but like many other people at this time, they come back from Europe, which is just war-torn and destroyed, and the idea is like, let's bring life back into the world. And so you have a huge boom, huge population boom at this time, and it's a time of prosperity. As long as you're Caucasian, that is, loans are given to veterans. So you only needed a small down payment for a house. And for the most part, people in this 1950s period, they could kind of afford like a house, kids, a car, and post-secondary education. So it's this time in history where if you're in North America, everything seems possible. You can rise up the ranks and you can really live that like so-called American or Canadian dream. Um, but I mean, for people of visible minorities and immigrants, it's not all the opportunities are available to everyone. Although things are beginning to get better. Suburbanization. So veterans coming home from the war, in many cases they're treated a lot better than in the First World War, and they're given their jobs back, and they're able to kind of restart their lives. And a lot of this revolves around the automobile. So the automobile is making suburban life possible because many people work in the cities, and with so many affordable automobiles out on the market, people are able to live in the suburbs and commute to the cities. And so there's a lot of help coming from the government. Out of World War II, governments began to become more invested in their people and more willing to try to solve social problems. So the veterans coming back from World War II, they're examples. The way that they're given money and advantages, it's an example of the Canadian welfare state. So what that means is things like universal health care, pensions, social security. These are things that the government does to benefit the greater good of its people. And so the Canadian welfare state is beginning under the Liberals and even the Conservatives in this time. It's expanding and it's becoming more beneficial for Canadian families. And also, this period is really emphasizing traditional family values. So many women in World War II were working in factories, and now, the men are home. They don't have to do that anymore. So women go back to the home and go back to their traditional roles of homemakers and raising families. But many women kind of push back against that, and many women feel there is some kind of problem here that women are still being treated as second-class citizens in this 1950s North America. There's a woman named Betty Friedan, and she writes this book called The Feminine Mystique. And in this book, she talks about the problem with no name, that many women at the time felt that just being a homemaker, just staying home with the kids, that wasn't enough for them, that they wanted more fulfillment in their lives, more self-actualization. Another aspect of this 1950s culture is consumerism. So we start to get this idea of endless consumerism, the idea that you buy a pair of shoes, and within 3 or 4 months, that pair of shoes is replaceable, and we can buy something else. So advertising becomes really important in this period, and people become more consumers. People need to focus their energies towards material goods now that the war is over. Society needs to focus itself into mass production. So these are some changes going on in the 1950s. Here is a question. Hopefully you can see this. It's not too dark. It says key milestones in Canada's development as a social welfare state. Public pensions, unemployment insurance, and blank. So which Canadian social welfare program completes this list? So we're looking at things that are really important. And what do you guys think? What's the best one? I think we talked about in an earlier unit. Tommy Douglas of the NDP in Saskatchewan became premier. in the 1950s, and he was the first premier, and Saskatchewan was the first province to put in universal health care, which we had by the 1960s in Canada, and in the United States, they still do not have universal health care. If you propose universal health care, a lot of people in America today will call you a communist, even though you're just doing what Canada has been doing for 50 plus years. 60 years, actually. Okay, now we move to the Massey Commission. The Massey Commission is a royal commission. It's developed and chaired by the Chancellor of the University of Toronto, Vincent Massey. And it was appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada at the time. His name was Louis Saint Laurent. And Louis Saint Laurent was the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and he was the chairman for Canada at the United Nations. He became the Liberal leader in 1948, and he stepped down after being defeated in 1957, so Prime Minister for quite a long time. Now, the Massey Report, it encouraged a wide range of state-funded cultural activities like the National Library of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, more aid to universities so that people could afford to go to university who didn't have a lot of money, the National Film Board to create and promote Canadian films. And the idea was to promote Canadian culture in television, in media, because the United States was so influential. Now, people watched a lot of American television, and so the concern was, are we just going to become Americans? So Saint Laurent and the Massey Commission believed Canadian culture was anemic, meaning not strong enough. But there was a lot of pushback against the Massey Commission. And people said, why should we fund the arts? Like, the arts don't pay for themselves. And if they don't pay for themselves, why do they deserve to exist? Even Saint Laurent said sarcastically that, why are we funding ballet dancers? And he worried about the political fallout. But eventually in 1957, they acted and they funded Canadian arts fully. Now, this kind of thing was normal in Europe, but it was pretty revolutionary in North America to fund media and arts to promote Canadian identity. Television began a golden era. So this is an era where both Canadian and American television become really prominent. And almost everyone by the end of this decade has a TV, black and white TV, in their home. So sitcoms become very popular, like I Love Lucy. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, also has very popular programs, particularly Hockey Night in Canada. And advertising and corporate involvement become more common in people's lives. People begin to become bombarded with more and more commercials. Now, in order to protect Canada from American influence, the Canadian government produces the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio Television Commission. And the idea is to regulate the amount of foreign content on the airwaves. So you have to, as a Canadian broadcasting station, you have to have a certain amount of Canadian artists or a song or a video or whatever produced by Canadians. And that exists until today. A lot of radio stations, for example, you might hear a lot of Nickelback or something Canadian that maybe you don't like that much, but the fact is that we still regulate foreign content and promote Canadian content on the airwaves because of the CRTC. Okay, the beginning of the Cold War. Now, if you remember from the World War II unit, the seeds of the Cold War already existed. And one of the main things was that it took the Allies, the British, Canadian, and English forces a really long time to open up that second front. And while that was happening, the Soviet Union was being decimated by the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht. So the Soviets already were very suspicious of the United States. And some people think that this conflict was inevitable. Now, once the Soviets gained nuclear capability in 1949, it basically meant something called mutually assured destruction, meaning a war between the two sides was result in such a terrible consequences that it made war unlikely. But the Soviets and the Americans were going to fund other wars, other hot wars in other places. So that's going to be in Korea, in Vietnam, and numerous other places. It causes both sides to support, even the Americans as well, to support horrible regimes in order to fight their ideological enemies. So the US and South America, they support all sorts of anti-communist regimes that end up kind of being a little bit fascist. So I want you guys to know about two terms from this time, or two events. One is called the Marshall Plan. So George Marshall, American general, he created something called the European Recovery Program Plan after World War II. And that gave $15 billion to Western European nations to rebuild their war-torn cities after the war. The Soviet Union they turned down this money. And the reason was they thought that America would be influencing their country if they took that money. And the idea was that if the Americans spent this money in Europe, it would combat communism. It would stop communism from spreading. The other term is the Truman Doctrine. So remember, President Truman took over when President Roosevelt died in 1945. And Truman's idea about fighting communism was, wherever it appears, we will fight it. And so in response to communism nearly taking over Greece and Turkey, the Truman Doctrine said, we will fund any anti-communists in order to fight the spread of communism. So the whole goal of the Soviet Union at the time is to maintain their empire in Eastern Europe, but also to expand communism to the rest of the world. So this is where the origins of the Cold War come from. And it's called Cold War because it's fought not on the battlefield, but behind the scenes with spies, with espionage, and with funding of secret government agencies and wars that are happening in developing nations. So here's Winston Churchill, and remember, he was out of power by 1946, replaced by Clement Attlee, but he still had a lot to say about the world. And being no fan of Stalin, Churchill never liked dictators. He made a speech at Fulton, Missouri in 1946, and he was asking Americans to have a special relationship. The Americans are a little skeptical of Churchill because he's still part of this British Empire. He still wants to keep the British Empire. But just like America, he is afraid of the spread of communism. So he says in this speech, quote, "From Stettin in the Balkans to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has ascended across Europe. Behind that line lies the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe." Sir Winston Churchill, 1946. So what he's talking about is a line between the Baltic Sea and the Adriatic Sea, and behind that line, an iron curtain, and that means Soviet control. And in these Soviet countries, people cannot leave. There's not a lot of freedom, and the Soviets basically control all the governments. They have ceased to be democratic. And so instead of having Hitler in control of your country, now you have Stalin, and things aren't that much better. So for people in Eastern Europe, the war didn't really end. They were basically dominated by communism for the next 45 years or so. So Churchill was warning the world here about the Iron Curtain. So as a result of this fear, something called the North Atlantic Treaty was created. The NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed to combat the Soviet aggression. Okay, Canada is one of the founding nations of NATO. And you can read about NATO in your textbooks on page 194 to 195. So in 1949, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and 12 other nations in total were created a military alliance to counter the threat of the Soviets. So kind of like an alliance system. This was also in response to a coup d'etat or overthrow of a government that was sponsored by the Soviet Union in 1948 over Czechoslovakia. So the Soviets took over Czechoslovakia, and also in 1948 they blockaded Berlin, and Berlin was divided into zones of occupation, and the west part of Berlin was controlled by the Allies. So the Soviets blocked it off, and as a result, the Allies did something called the Berlin Airlift, where they parachuted in supplies so that West Berlin could survive. And eventually, the Soviets gave up and lifted that barrier to ground access of Berlin. The Soviets, in response to NATO, created something called the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw being a city in Poland. And the Warsaw Pact included countries, the Soviet satellite states, countries that were essentially controlled by the Soviet Union. And these are nations like Albania, Romania, Poland, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. So the world is divided into two camps. We're going to call this a bipolar world. And NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. And as I said, Germany is divided up into East and West now. And Berlin is in East Germany, but Berlin is divided up into two. And the Russians are going to build the Berlin Wall to make sure people don't escape into the western part of Berlin. Okay, what two ideologies were separated by the Iron Curtain? This should be an easy question. Think about it, maybe pause the video, and try to figure out two ideologies separated by the Iron Curtain. Well, if you picked C, communism and democracy, you are correct. Those are the two main ideologies. The next one, Canada, the United States, and Western Europe joined together to defend democracy. Well, what did we just talk about? What is this headline referring to in 1949? To defend democracy, well, the United Nations had all of the countries in it, so not all of them are democratic. So what they're talking about is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in China during this Cold War period. This is not really in the textbook, but I think it's interesting. So we're going to talk about it anyways. So the Nationalist Party in China, under Chiang Kai-shek, during World War II, there was basically three competing powers in China. The Japanese controlled areas, the Nationalists or the Kuomintang controlled areas, and the Communists under Mao Zedong. They controlled a lot of the hinterland or the rural regions in the interior of China. And ultimately, the communists win. So even though the nationalists had help from the United States government, The communists were supported by the Soviet Union, and Mao's forces ultimately were able to convince enough peasants to join their side and able to take over all of China in by 1949. So at this time, China was lagging behind a lot of other nations. It was not very modern. And so Chairman Mao was inspired by Stalin, and he wanted to bring China into become a more modern society. So he wanted to create 5-year plans, just like Stalin did in the Soviet Union, to modernize China. So he created a target system in which Chinese industry was supposed to produce more oil, more coal, more iron, more steel between 1952 and 1957. After that, he puts in another plan called the Great Leap Forward. Okay? And the Great Leap Forward takes the farming systems or agricultural systems in China and it collectivizes them. And it is supposed to free up more men to work and make industrial things, make steel. So Mao encourages every community to make these backyard steel furnaces, but they don't produce steel that can be really used in industrial for industrial uses. There's very poor quality steel, and meanwhile, the agriculture of China is thrown into disarray, and so China can't produce enough food for its citizens. And it leads to the Great Famine. Okay, so in China, there is between 20 and 45 million, some people think up to 55 million, that people that die due to these poor decisions by the Communist Party. Nobody knows exactly how many people died in these famines, but it's incredible. It's possibly more than all the people killed in World War II. Here's a photograph of the steel furnaces from the Great Leap Forward. And during this period, people in China, they're not put into positions of power because of their expertise in industry or in agriculture. They're put in because of their ideological purity. So people who are followers of the Communist Party get rewarded as a result. And Mao has to consolidate his power because things have gone so poorly in the 1950s. In the 1960s, he creates something called the Cultural Revolution. And that lasts for about 10 years. So it's a way for Mao to destroy his enemies in China. And he recruits groups of students, of young people, to be his Red Guards. And they denounce their teachers. In fact, there's examples of students beating their teachers to death. Please don't do that to me, guys. And they want to get rid of what's called the four olds, the old culture, the old habits, the old ideas, and the old customs. This is a radical version of communism that Mao's trying to put in, and it kind of backfires. So people are beaten up, are murdered for very minor infractions, including wearing clothes considered too bourgeois or too fancy, not conforming to revolutionary spirit, and this kind of spirals out of control. And again, nobody knows how many victims of the Cultural Revolution, but it could be up to 2 million. And ultimately, what you were seeing is these Mao had these little red books of quotes, and 1 billion copies of this little red book were printed. And this is an example of kind of brainwashing. Mao wanted to brainwash the young people of China into this communist ideology. And later leaders of China denounced what Mao did, including Deng Xiaoping, who dismantled the very extreme communist ideology. And Deng Xiaoping, he would make China more capitalist, and he would be more of the father of modern China. Even though in China today, Mao is still celebrated. He Deng Xiaoping said in 1981 about the Cultural Revolution, quote, responsible for the most severe setback and the heaviest losses suffered by the party, the country, and the people since the founding of the People's Republic. So he put the blame on Mao for the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. Here is a picture of Mao and the little red books and the red guards. If anybody can translate that, maybe you write that in the comments. I'm not sure what that says. Maybe somebody can tell me what is going on in this propaganda poster of Chairman Mao. Okay, we're going to end it there for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll come back with part 2 of the Cold War series.